Thank you all. We will go to the session 7, that is to say the concluding one, and I will give the microphone to CG and to our new moderator. CG, please.
Thank you, Veronique and Ramsey. And I want to echo what was said earlier. I thought that was fascinating. I wish we had more time, but we do need to kind of keep things moving forward. And so with that in mind, I'm going to introduce the moderator actually for this next session, Director General Bill Magwood. Mr. Magwood has served as the Director General of the NEA since September 2014. Prior to this position, he served from 2010 to 2014 as one of the 5 commissioners appointed by the United States President and confirmed by the United States Senate to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. From 2005 to 2010, he provided independent strategic and policy advice on energy, environmental, and technology policy issues. From 1998 to 2005, Mr. Magwood was Director of Nuclear Energy at the United States Department of Energy. And during his tenure, he launched several important initiatives, including the Generation 4 International Forum and the formation of the Idaho National Laboratory. He began his career as a scientist for Westinghouse Electric Corporation and managing electric utility research and nuclear policy programs at the Edison Electric Institute. Mr. Magwood holds bachelor's degrees in physics and English from Carnegie Mellon University and a Master of Fine Arts from the University of Pittsburgh. Director General Magwood, please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. And we probably could have saved 5 minutes by dropping the bio, but what's done is done. It's a real pleasure to open this closing session of this very interesting and very productive workshop. Let me thank the last panel. I think it was a very excellent panel with a lot of very thoughtful comments. And what we're going to do now is to try to integrate the stories. So we'll ask representatives from each of the panels that have been conducted over the course of this workshop to give some summary views and to try to begin to coalesce towards identifying actionable items that we can pursue to build upon what we've learned in the course of the workshop and what the major takeaways will be. Again, to reiterate, we put 2 major challenges on the table. How should regulators approach the licensing of innovative disruptive technologies? And we've heard from many different sectors about how this is done in aerospace and pharma and many other areas. And how can regulators leverage international cooperation? And we heard about that from across the board as well. So we're going to have mostly the chairs from the various sessions come together to talk with us about this. And we will have then a discussion to try to identify what the major items will be. Now, all the panelists that you will hear from have already been introduced, so I'm not going to spend time to reintroduce them. Instead, we will charge forward, and I will begin by inviting Mark Foy to give his summary of the session 2. So Mark, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bill. Just for attendees, just to reflect that first session was very much around members of the nuclear sector across the globe and their views on the questions that were posed. I think the key challenges discussed during the panel session related very much to the harmonization of the licensing process and also the associated standard used by regulators and industry themselves, and then moved on to cover cooperation and the need to avoid undue burden. And then the conversation explored the important topic of building public trust when considering the changes to tried and tested approaches. It was also noted that there's a lack of universally recognized standards for advanced nuclear technologies. And given the cost and times associated with the development of new codes and standards, there was a view that was expressed that organizations may seek to maximize the use of existing codes and standards as the best way to proceed, instead of creating new codes and standards. We also talked about the need to take a step forward in the demonstration of harmonized approach by engaging early in the process and starting potentially with a small number of countries on a specified topic. And so examples were covered in relation to perhaps standardization and standards for materials and the ways to achieve quality. Potentially also looking at using a functional equivalence approach, and that may potentially be the best way to proceed. There's recognition also of the bilateral work that's currently underway between the US and Canada, and that was cited as a good example. And so that then moved on to perhaps it would be best to have cooperation of a small group of countries that can then potentially expand to a larger number of countries to achieve that harmonization goal. Panelists also agreed that everyone has a role to play in building trust, and that the public will be looking to the regulator to confirm the safety of new technologies. And in order to further build that public trust, a panelist did actually suggest engaging NGOs in the process to promote openness around nuclear. It was also suggested that the international standards associations could assist in spreading the message across the entire sector and looking to get those common standards. Openness and transparency in the safety review process was also thought as being a vehicle to build trust, alongside of making the safety basis public available. That could then help to generate public confidence. Other areas that were covered also was facilitating international cooperation for harmonization of requirements, mainly centered around the support of governments and greater coordination by the industry. So highlighting the role of governments in the whole process and policymakers. They identified a lack of policy direction and support from individual governments, which could help regulators to work establishing and implementing processes for harmonization. Suggestion was also made to have the industry coordinate an approach to harmonization of codes and standards in order to facilitate international adoption. Presenters also stated that it's important to be forward-looking for harmonization and not look to retrofit existing codes and standards, so coming full circle from some of the earlier comments. Again, starting with that smaller group around licensing on a same or similar design and expanding the approach from there. It was also considered that if there aren't high levels of trust then from the public, then it will be difficult to advance internationally. And it's trying to build that strong base upon which we can all move forward on. It was also suggested that there's a need to find common grounds from an acceptable safety perspective, the common equivalent of a safety case. And panelists agreed that there's a role for the international organizations like the NEA and the IAEA to play a role in enhancing public trust. We then moved on to looking at an example of how those challenges are being overcome. And there were various examples provided from the EU-sponsored study, the European Reactor Design Acceptance, the ERDA analysis report published in 2019, that sets out things around the complexity of collaboration and how it can be quite slow to reach consensus. And then you have piling up, you have mounting up of inconsistent requirements. It's also the issue around access to new vendors, and that European reactor design acceptance would only make sense if realistic for the design is chosen by the operators. But in all of the discussions, and I think all through the week as well, there have been common themes highlighted, session 2 speakers and others, when considering how many of the challenges to regulate innovation could be overcome. So the nuclear sector and those involved in session 2 were quite clear that regulators do need to be accessible and have to have that enabling mindset, working in a collaborative manner and being outcome focused. Some of the things that were actually mentioned earlier today as well, being adaptable, flexible and agile, open-minded to new and novel solutions and not being closed-minded, and looking at designs and alternative ways of considering them. And also then moving on to undertaking effective horizon scanning, so you can prepare yourself as a regulator to meet things that are going to be coming to you. Early engagement of vendors and with regulators and outside of the sector would help with that. Also using that graded approach to regulating small modular reactors, having a flexible regulatory framework that incorporates a risk-informed decision-making process. And then on the other topic of public trust, the importance of having a robust, adequate resource and independent regulator was mentioned many times. So in terms of actionable items, it was mentioned that governments have a significant role in advancing trust in harmonized nuclear technology. Engagement with governments at policy level would help regulators establish that risk-informed, harmonised process in support of national licensing process. And it was just then that the NEA and the IAEA would have that role to play in speaking to governments, looking to influence them, initiating those conversations. So although specific follow-up actions weren't discussed, it was acknowledged by all participants that everyone has actually got a role to play in building trust and moving forward with innovation and harmonisation. Hopefully that's it in a nutshell from session 2, and I answer any questions in the panel session. Thank you, Bill.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mark. That was a very, very good summary. So we'll move on and get a summary of session 3 from Christian Slafer Heidengarder, who, as you recall, is the Secretary General of EuroK. So Christian, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, and delighted to cover session 3, where aviation was speaking and trying to give their input. And we started already with a bit of a language issue, because what we are calling licensing is called in aviation certification. So the licensing, when you speak about licensing, it's a pilot license, it's a maintenance license, versus the certification process is to certify a product, what is an aircraft or an engine. So then we were composed by an interesting group representing the global frame. So we also had a UN organization dealing with the global frame in aviation called ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. We had a member representing an innovative solution, urban air mobility, a newcomer in aviation. I want to come that a little bit more in detail. We had the bigger ecosystem on that, the whole a representative in the full transport sector, representing the full transport sector. So what we identified is that we, from the beginning on, we were lucky in aviation. We started already with a global frame. We started already with an international frame. Aviation was from the beginning on an international challenge and a global challenge. So therefore, ICAO, which was established in 1944, took from the beginning on an essential rule in establishing a global framework and global standards. So we also discussed that more and more nowadays, the industry and the regulators are coming closer together and sharing already from the beginning their plans, knowledge transfer, roadmaps on implementation, best practices of industry, and how to use that. So this was seen as a good step forward compared to the way we had in the past. But also we're seen, especially in the newcomers in aviation, urban air mobility, drones, that there is a more interdisciplinary playground nowadays, and not so much focusing on aviation per se. So it is an interdisciplinary ecosystem when we implement urban air mobility now in a city structure and in a city transport structure. So we spoke a lot on how we treat safety and how we ensure safety in aviation, especially what are we doing with accidents, with incidents, who is responsible for what in an accident, who is responsible to make an evaluation, to make recommendations against that, and what we are doing globally. Very particular, single cases in aviation sometimes leads to retrofit requirements for the whole fleet in aviation. And don't forget, only commercial air transport are 25,000 aircrafts over the world. So we are good in that, at least, and in making sure that safety concerns are addressed and we improve safety permanently. We also have seen that the new entrances, the pace of innovation, the pace of the newcomers in aviation have changed a little bit the regulatory scope. So we are moving from prescriptive requirements into much more performance-based, risk-based, and operation-centric requirements. And that made also a difference. And coming back to the full ecosystem, it's also more and more a factor, the social acceptance and the public acceptance. So it's nowadays quite usual that you have a rescue helicopter over a city taking care, but the acceptance is not the same if a drone goes over a city and delivering packages. We have also seen that this global framework also helped us in ensuring safety, but on the other side also ensuring harmonization, global harmonization, and worldwide interoperability. As we said, aviation is always, you're moving from one side of the world to the other side of the world. There need to be interoperability, there need to be global harmonization, and here we are good. But that also means that we have to be sure what and how we implement something, because it lasts for very, very long. And that brings me to the point where we are not good in aviation to make any changes to that at the end. So if we identify, for example, that we need to change the way we're communicating from an aircraft to the ground, we need to retrofit overnight 25,000 aircrafts. And that's not an easy task to do. And therefore, we have to make sure what we implement. If we put something on top, if we implement something new, yes, innovation can be treated quite well. To do it retrofit, it's much more complicated. We also discussed that it's quite usual that we are dealing industry, regulators, but also standards complementing the regulatory frame. And we have many international organizations. I represent one doing standards for aviation, solely for aviation. Then we also discuss, let me just, yes, it's not that we are not treating only technology anymore. That's indeed the full ecosystem we are taking into account, and that makes it even more necessary that we are moving this more risk-based and operation-centric approach. Again, innovation is something which we have seen is coming with a much faster speed pace to aviation as well. The safety level, the level of safety cannot be compromised. That's the reason we went into something not only to investigate any more accidents, we are investigating also incidents, already serious incidents, to keep the level of safety stable while the air traffic is still increasing. So those are the goals, and that's what we try to achieve. And at the same time, we have to deal with newcomers, as I said, drones, urban air mobility, and more of those comings. And we are taking also technologies which are outside of the frame of aviation. We were very much used to have a closed structure in aviation, which is not the case anymore. Drones is a typical example. Urban air mobility is a typical example where we are using telecommunication providers and city providers, city organizations, and regulators for that. With that, I thank you very much for allowing me to summarize session 3. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and excellent summary. And I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions that involve you at the panel discussion, because the comparison between aerospace and nuclear often gets made. And I'd appreciate to give you a chance to talk about that a bit further. On to session 4 summary from Jean-Christophe Niel, who is Director General of the Institute of Radiological Protection and Nuclear Safety of France, and also the chair of the NEA's Committee on the Safety of Nuclear Installations. Jean-Christophe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much. So session 4 was more oriented on the transportation of nuclear material. About 190 people attended to it. I will make a summary that will probably miss some points, and I apologize for that. I organized a summary around 3 points. The first one is the key challenges about regulatory approval for an innovative technology. To build the largest part of this summary, and it was the largest part of the session. The existing prescriptive framework for transport did not discourage innovation in the sector, considered the panelists. Organizations were and are able to work with regulators during the approval process without compromising safety. Panelists discuss challenges faced in transportation of nuclear materials in view of innovative technologies. Several points. The panel discussed if there is a need of increased flexibility in regulation to cope with innovation in transporting nuclear material. The existing regulatory framework is prescriptive and can be seen as a limitation for innovation. On the other hand, although it is prescriptive, it stays quite general. The idea that complying with existing regulation should be taken into account very early in the development of innovation was mentioned to ease the process. If a friendly to safety innovation is limited by regulation, evolution of regulation should be studied, mentioned the panelist. Innovation should be based on a current regulation and adapted as necessary. Industry and regulatory bodies should interact early, especially in the case of innovation. The importance to have strong and valid technical information to support the approval of innovative technologies was emphasized by the panelists. Another challenge comes from the difference between countries in the international transport recommendation from AIA implementation. It is due to history, to specific needs, keeping in mind that in the end, this is a national responsibility. Sustained government support must be looked at along with industry engagement in international cooperation. Some potential inconsistency were stressed. For example, between safety and security, it was noted during the discussion that on most issues, nuclear safety and nuclear security for transport are generally consistent, but for some of them, it is not the case. And then there is a need to examine the balance between safety and security, and there is a need to find the optimized solution regarding both safety and security. Another potential inconsistencies the following. There is an harmonization at the level of regulation, but this harmonization at the level of regulation doesn't guarantee harmonization on the ground. And there is also a need, apart from the harmonization of the regulation, to develop on the ground technical harmonization. The second point of discussion was key challenges to facilitate international collaboration and harmonization of requirements. The discussion demonstrated that harmonization is achievable, and the case of transportation of nuclear material is a good example, the so-called IEA SSR 6. Nevertheless, it takes collaborative efforts to achieve harmonization. The experience from transport also shows that working with a core of principles like the SSR 6 is at the same time effective and efficient. It was considered that regulators adopt and consent to the recurrence under SSR 6 without impediment to innovation. Another challenge mentioned by the panel concerns collaboration between policymakers, regulators, and operators. This relationship is key in developing inclusive, fit-for-purpose ways of working, a basis for mutual trust to be built within the international community in order to enable harmonization on a global scale. 60 years of regulatory experience has helped achieve harmonization in regulating the transportation of nuclear material, and this experience has led to increase the level of knowledge and cooperation between member states. And the panelists agree that the framework is continuously improving and will continue to overcome the challenge it faces. One of the challenges considered was the time scale of the regulatory change, especially when it concerns innovative technology. There were some more specific points dedicated to transportation. It was said that the transportation committee needs to address the challenge of attracting a new generation of people and attaining gender parity. There was some concern about the transport of SMR and floating NPPs, and it was considered that there was a need to see how the regulation for safe and secure transport of the so-called core device could be done. And last, in order to overcome the challenge with innovation, transportation need to be considered early, so that it can be seen as an enabler instead of a constraint during the life life cycle process. Here are the main points of the session 4, Mr. Director General.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that summary. You covered a lot of material there, and we'll have a few questions about that as we go forward. Now we'll move on to a summary of session 5. That session was chaired by Dr. Ensmond, but he unfortunately is not available. So the session coordinator, CJ Fung, will provide the summary. CJ, floor is yours.
Thank you, Director General. Yes, I'm not Dr. Ensmond, but I'll try my best. We talked about medical technologies in session 5, and primarily that centered around 3 major areas: vaccines, drugs, and medical devices. Medical devices include things like pacemakers, prosthetics, but also neuro equipment, neurodetection and neurotherapy equipment. And we identified and discussed a number of challenges that licensees or vendors had encountered getting some of these products from concept into actual market where they can treat patients. And I won't go over all of them in the interest of time, but I picked 4 that I think were very relevant to the larger conversation. One is the pacing problem that you heard actually Bruce Chu talk about in the previous section, where you've got an issue of a product, a technology evolving very, very quickly and becoming more and more prevalent, and how does the regulator keep up with that? So I think that's a common theme that came up in the medical panel, but also other panels. The second was the issue of public trust. And I thought one of the very interesting topics that we discussed in session 5 was that trust is not really a binary matter. It's not a matter of simply the public trusting or not trusting a technology, but also if you kind of drill down, there's a lot of reasons. And so we talked about, for example, reasons that members of the public had said they would not get a COVID-19 vaccine, for example. And we looked at a country by country breakdown, and it was, I think, very interesting. The reasons that people stated and how they varied from across different countries and different cultures. And so I think that underscored the importance of public trust, but also that's important to think about why the public has a concern. Do they not trust the technology? Do they not trust the regulator? The third challenge would be some of the difficulties assessing risk of some of the medical technologies. And so we talked about the need for a sort of risk-informed framework, but that can be difficult because there's such a range of things you're talking about. How do you look at the risk of a prosthetic arm versus the risk of a vaccine for a baby, a child? So there's such a range in medicine that it's difficult to have just sort of one risk metric, one core damage frequency type number. And the fourth was privacy issues. When you talk about things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, you can run into some privacy matters because you've got very sensitive medical data. And so sometimes there's a reluctance to adopt some of these technologies because there's a concern of people's private medical information getting out there. So those were the 4 challenges. I'll just go briefly to some quick examples of how those challenges were overcome. The panelists talked about having a framework that can accommodate innovation, and that being very important. Rethinking what regulatory approval means. That one I thought was quite interesting. One of the panelists talked about in the past, regulatory approval for a medical test was kind of a one and done. Once you got that approval, that was it. And so there was sometimes a reluctance from the regulator to issue that approval because they knew how difficult it would be to retract if new medical information came out after the fact. And in the kind of COVID-19 world that we're in, the panel talked about a shorter approval process, but also providing the regulator the ability to pull that approval back quickly if the data drove them in that direction. And that helped kind of speed things up. The third was the use of cost-free pre-licensing activities. In other words, letting a manufacturer of a medical device come in and talk to the regulator ahead of time with no cost to them, just to see if there's any showstoppers. And that was viewed as an effective way to foster innovation and let some of these smaller companies get their foot in the door and find out before they went through a long, expensive licensing process if their product had major potential red flags or if the regulator had serious concerns. And the fourth was a graded approach to risk. The panel talked about, for medical devices, kind of a 3-tiered approach to looking at them, depending on the potential impact the product could have to the customer, the patient, I should say. And so that kind of graded risk-informed approach is used in medical devices, and I think there's obviously parallels on the nuclear side of the house. As far as action items, again, I'm not sure that we necessarily identified, sort of classify them in this way, like this is a specific action item for this group to do. But I took some of the key insights and turned them into action items. I think one would be for us to study some of the US Food and Drug Administration's risk guidance. They have some guidance on applying a risk-informed approach, and what it looked like to me, just at first glance, kind of either a semi-quantitative or qualitative fashion. I think that could be useful and interesting. I think we need to study that a little bit in more detail. Support the development of a framework for advanced reactor licensing. I know some countries are working on that, but I think that was very consistent with the message the medical panelists had about having a framework that fosters innovation, that can accommodate innovation. So I think having a framework for advanced reactors that does that makes a lot of sense. There was a 5-stage process for consensus building that was presented. Not going to get into it here in the interest of time, but that seemed like an interesting approach for the nuclear or any sector really to explore. If you're looking to get 2 or more countries to agree on a standard, for example, they walked us through a process they used to do that. I think there's some value there. And then I mentioned the cost-free pre-licensing activities. I think that's something worth exploring as well. I know, traditionally in the reactor world, there's been 2 or 3 major vendors, and they've been willing to come in and do a lot of pre-licensing work and pay for it. I saw a slide the other day that there's something like 75 small modular reactor concepts out there, some of them coming from very small kind of startup companies. And so perhaps in order to foster innovation and let those companies kind of get their foot in the door, some sort of cost-free or cost-sharing or just reduced cost pre-licensing process for them might be valuable. So I think that's something that's worth exploring. So that's all I had, Director General. Thanks for the opportunity to fill in, and look forward to any questions that the audience might have.
Excellent. Very well done. Very good summary. And we'll move on to the last session, which is session 6, which we had just earlier today. Mr. Chu will give that summary. And please, Bruce, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm delighted to give the summary, or at least attempt to give the summary. We've just rolled off of that one, and its intention was to bring a diverse group together, and I think we certainly accomplished that in the last session. So I'll do my best to summarize the diverse discussion that we had. First, interesting, there were a lot of similarities. We in fact talked about drones some, we talked about medical devices some. The importance of industry participation was stressed by several speakers. Things that you mentioned earlier, adaptability, outcomes-based regulation, risk-informed regulation, collaborative regulation, all of those themes came up as well. But if I were to talk about sort of to tie together, or to try to tie together sort of the arc of the narrative as we had our panel, we started off talking about how there is in fact a structural phenomenon about today's world that involves rapid innovation, rapid scale up of innovations, and the innovations bringing along disruption in business models. So the disruption is not just about new technologies, but also new business models that go with them. The distinction between defining yourself as a power generator tied to the grid and defining yourself as a fuel company, parts of the apparatus of those are similar from a technological standpoint, from a business model standpoint, from a market opportunity standpoint, from a where does it connect to different opportunities in space and also in time, all differ if you bring those 2 frames in mind. And so the need for regulators to cope with this new changing world of more rapid, more frequent, more disruptive innovation was sort of a theme for the day. And the importance of, or the reality that it is a broad-based phenomenon was brought home as we looked at a variety of industries. We looked at energy, we looked at maritime and talked specifically about the parallels between the maritime certification process on an international front and nuclear regulation. We talked about telecom. We talked about the insurance industry, which I thought was a particularly interesting topic, as it too has to deal with how do I assess risk and what level of risk is acceptable in part of its everyday life. And at the same time, it is a regulated entity. And so I found that a particularly interesting perspective to bring to bear. In the course of that discussion, I think the similarity across industries is one that came home. The convergence of some of these technologies across industries came home too. That specifically one of the questions that was asked, for example, was remote telecom communication with power plant controls. And so telecom is suddenly part of electrical generation. All these industries are converging. And in fact, that's what's often talked about in the tech sector, is convergence as the source of these disruptive business models. We talked quite a bit about ecosystems, something that came up in the drones discussion, the unmanned aircraft discussion. We talked quite a bit about that, the nature of these being disruptive and the effects on the ecosystem, in some ways calling for an ecosystem response. And I thought Catherine's discussion of the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, an organization that's been around since the 1860s and has gone from radios to satellites, but in the course of that has evolved with a continually changing, increasingly diverse set of participants and radically changing issues and tools. I think that sort of ecosystem collaborative response in dealing with a changing world is an interesting example to hold on to. So it's not just we need to be more collaborative, but we need to be collaborative with who? A broader net in terms of other agencies like ourselves around the world, a broader net in terms of industry and regulators, and other interested parties, a broader net in terms of which industries, a broader net in terms of which types of regulation. All of that is sort of an expanding circle that is appropriate response, I think, to the ecosystem disruption. Two final things I really want to hit on. One is the risk aspect, which was stressed. Risk is at the heart of insurance. Risk is at the heart of everything that's done as regulators. And I thought it was interesting to see that taken apart, sort of what are the key, the different components of different types of risk being an important part of clarity. We talk about performance-based regulation. It's talking about outcomes. In some ways, that risk perspective is similar sort of, we need to think broadly about classes, not narrowly, but broadly about different sources of risk. And the idea in some of the examples cited that in addition to all the emerging innovations we're also seeing emerging risks, that the greater globalization caused, wheat prices in China to be a factor. Cybersecurity is a factor that was talked about in that discussion. And so I think both the risk focus is appropriate, but also that unbundling of risk, just we're sort of unbundling business models, unbundling the risk and identifying new sources of risk was important. The thing I wanted to end on was actually something that Christy said. You'll recall, those who heard, she talked about the impossible burger. There were important unsolved problems, critical unsolved problems in the world. And the impossible burger, the vegetable burger sold through McDonald's at the same price to the same taste buds, I think was her example of you need to ask the question, what would it take? And CJ knows this is something I do in my practice a lot, working with enterprises. I say, what would have to be true for us to do this? And I think as a call to deal with the changing world, we're going to need to be continually asking, okay, this is a new challenge. What would have to be true for us to be able to cope with this effectively? And I think that's sort of a call to arms for a rethinking of traditional roles as regulators, as entities, as ecosystems and partnerships. But the good news is many of the technologies that are disrupting the world you are trying to regulate are also, that world of innovation is also offering up new tools for regulators. And so the potential to be able to use virtual reality or AI and so on to enhance and make more effective regulation in this changing world is an exciting opportunity. And so I guess I'd end with that, that what would have to be true as a focus in this changing world, because it's not, we need to find the solution at this point in time. We're going to need to keep rediscovering solutions as innovation continues.
Very good. Thank you very much for that. And your session was a quite diverse and interesting one, and a lot of interesting thoughts came out of that. So thank you for the summary. So we're going to move on to the panel discussion. We have about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit less, to discuss what we've heard over the last several days. And one person who has been able to integrate a lot of the thinking around this has been Ramzi Jamal, our partner in the planning and implementation of this workshop, who moderated many of the discussions over the course of the last 5 days. So I'd like to invite Ramzi to give his point of view on what he heard from a regulator standpoint and what he thinks a potential path forwards might be based on what we've been hearing. So Ramzi, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much, DG Magwood. I have a presentation. I'll go through it quickly. So from my perspective, first and foremost, I would like to thank my colleagues at the NEA and our colleagues who panelists and gave really good presentations and good thoughts for us. Made my life very, very, very easy. So my lessons learned will be broken up. First, I'll start with harmonization. Harmonization requires the willingness to be open, collaborative. Regulatory framework must adapt in response to ongoing innovation. Harmonization of standards and guidance provide predictability and clarity for industry and regulators. And we heard this from colleagues from the industry representation. International regulations and guidance, and it's the development of guidance, should be all inclusive to complement prescriptive regulations and or binding conventions. As we all know, the conventions are very, very static, very difficult to change, but the establishment of guidance can put in place compliance of implementation and associated with the guidance or outdated safety standards. Regulatory harmonization needs to look beyond technology design to include supporting infrastructure, and the supporting infrastructure can be done at all levels to include capability of knowledge management, as it was discussed, and I'm going to keep it at high level. The lessons learned with respect to international collaboration. The international collaboration will become more effective in smaller member states groups that focus on topics of mutual interest. And definitely there'll be a challenge for you, DG Magwood, and the IAA with respect to the all-inclusive requirements under international organizations. Cross-functional working groups that includes regulators, industry, and the public have demonstrated that they deliver more valuable outcomes. And this was one of the key outcomes from the airline industries. A dialogue need to be established between regulators and innovators very early on, and building mutual trust within the international community can enable cooperation on a global level. But we cannot forget that collaboration must include the public. The challenges were thrown at us at the beginning with respect to risk-informed decision-making, leverage information lessons learned, balancing harmonization and sovereignty, and ensuring public trust. I will address very briefly each one of them. The workshop observation calls for adoption of a flexible performance-based regulatory framework to meet the safety objectives of existing conventions. Government support at the policy level can help regulators establish risk-informed harmonization processes for licenses or certification, which will eliminate duplication, increase efficiencies in support of the licensing process. Challenge number 2, and its observation, leveraging information lessons learned. Success in global harmonization requires substantial international commitment involving numerous players. That was addressed by the summary of the panels. Consulting with stakeholders is a central part of the process when creating industry standards. International organizations such as the NEA and the IAA should conduct early engagement activities with industries, governments, NGOs to highlight the benefits of harmonization and the benefit to society arising from the nuclear applications. Challenge number 3, balancing harmonization sovereignty. We heard it very clearly from the panels that harmonization did not take away any national regulatory sovereignty. Early involvement of technical experts from regulators, industry, and government policymakers is key to establishing a regulatory framework that is adaptive to innovation and innovative technology. And that could be accomplished, for example, through the CSS, which is a technology neutral and in a technology neutral manner that commensurate with risk in order to help to establish international standards and guidance. And I want to put emphasis on guidance to implement the standards. Challenge number 4 was ensuring public trust. All of us and everyone has a role to play in fostering public trust. The key points were engage early, encourage openness and transparency in the process, communicate the benefits of emerging technology to encourage public acceptability, and create trust in the safety review process, make the safety basis publicly available to generate confidence of the public. Looking forward, step 1, start with small, and build. Going through the adoption of performance objective-based approaches provide a flexible, adaptive framework. Incorporate risk-informed decision-making when regulating innovative technology. Do not be afraid of the unknown. Have a good, capable understanding how to manage the unknown. By leveraging lessons learned and best practices from other sectors, international organizations. Again, innovation is not new to nuclear. Collaborate internationally. And step 5, engage stakeholders early, often, and be transparent to gain the public trust. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ramsey. I think that was a very, very astute summary and drawing of conclusions. Let me invite all panelists to come on camera and to join us for the panel discussion. And what I'll do is I'll start with an observation, and this resonates with one of the questions, because one of the questions that we did have highlighted the fact that there is no internationally accepted framework for standards in the nuclear area. So we don't have the kind of framework that we heard described in many of the other sectors, particularly aerospace and pharma and others. And I wonder, given that, is that the major difference perhaps between the nuclear sector and some of these other sectors? You know, let me simplify it this way. If you assume that international harmonization in many sectors relies on the development of standards in which the entire sector is a participant, industry, regulators, government, academia, everyone comes together to work on to develop these standards. We heard that described in some cases. That is not the way it works in the nuclear area. And I wonder if that is the essential difference between nuclear and the others. And let me direct this first to Mark Foy to respond from a regulator standpoint and to get his views on this. And maybe Jean-Christophe, you could also respond to this.
Okay, thank you very much, Bill. I think in terms of that global cooperation, there are bodies that exist that could facilitate it, and we brought it up in the summaries today. So we've got the NEA, we've got the IAEA, and they're there as multilateral representative bodies across the nuclear sector, across the nuclear industry, and the opportunities for those two bodies really to take this forward. However, some of the discussions that we've had already are indicating that if you're trying to get collective agreement on such grand scales, it will be quite difficult to do. And so under NEA, we had the MDEP process, you know, the design evaluation program for new reactors. And that is where a small group of like-minded regulators who were looking at similar technology, or the same technology, shall we say, were sharing their assessment work, identifying where issues were coming up, how they were being resolved, and developing common positions. Now, to my mind, that's cooperation and collaboration, but not at the level that we're talking about here. There's actually got to be that willingness, not just amongst the regulators. We've already highlighted it does need government support as well. So everybody involved here needs to recognize the benefits that will come from this greater collaboration and agreeing a suite or some framework of regulation for these innovative technologies as they come along.
And Mark, and I agree with your comment, but at the same time, as we heard in these other sectors, it's not just the regulators and the governments, it's also the industry, the academic community, supply community, the whole sector comes together. And are we equipped to do that? Maybe Jean-Christophe, you could react to that.
Yes, maybe some comments to your question. First, maybe I think there is a difference between the activities in industry connected with networks and flux and the other one. And for example, communication, transportation needs to cross the border. And so there is a need to deal with international harmonization. And to my knowledge, one of the oldest regulation regarding risk is international regulation regarding risk is a transportation regulation of hazardous goods, which is coming back to the end of the years of the 19th century. So I think this is a first difference because among nuclear matters, you have harmonization among transportation. And I think this is clearly linked to the fact that you don't have choice. You cross border if you want that the goods can just cross the border, you need that. So I think it's one difference. The other one is linked to nuclear. I think nuclear is suffering of two characteristics which leads to a very national approach. The first is that it is specific to the matter. The nuclear matter has been seen, at least at the end of Second World War, as a very national topic. Just look how it was developed in the countries. And so this is, I would say, from the governmental and institutional point of view. But operators have also their own responsibilities because they organize themselves, at least at the beginning of nuclear industry, to protect themselves and to avoid competition. And I will take a French example so that I won't be accused of taking example somewhere. The French technology, Framatome technology, was a US technology at the origin. And what did Framatome very quickly is to just modify it to make it a French one. In fact, at the beginning, it was international because it was common. And so I think the responsibility for this situation today is really shared between governments and operators. Now we try to make the reverse way, and it is a very difficult way. And I would like once more to take an example, which is MDEP. I was in this nuclear safety business at that time. I think Ramsey was too. And the ambition of MDEP, which was initiated by the NRC and very quickly joined by the French ASN, was to share authorization process at the beginning. The idea was for new reactors to be able to have a situation where an authority gives an authorization and it's applied, like for transportation, to other countries. And very quickly, it appears that it was too ambitious. And so MDEP lowers its ambitions. Nevertheless, very good job was done inside MDEP. But nevertheless, it shows that the aim of sharing authorization is a tough way. Now, I don't want to be pessimistic. I think that things are progressing slowly, but they are progressing. And this workshop shows that, and the job inside IEA, MDEP, even if the original target was not reached, did a very good job, for example, on inspection, of sharing codes. And so I think we need to continue to work.
Thank you very much. And let me shift to Christian, because there were several questions that we had related to the parallels or perceived parallels between aviation and nuclear in many respects. And as I reflect on what Jean-Christophe just said, when you go back and you think about the history, when we first started seeing nuclear plants being built, it was a very national program. You know, the UK built reactors for the UK, the US built reactors for the US. You know, the Canadians were building reactors for Canada, and the idea of export was something that I think people thought about, but it wasn't at the core of the mission. In aviation, when people were building those early airliners, they wanted to sell them around the world, and I think there was always a thought that we were going to have to be more international, and so is there perhaps, Christian, something elemental in the legal and regulatory framework for aviation that makes it easier to deploy new technologies and deploy innovation in the aviation sector? Is there something that you can highlight, perhaps, please?
Thank you. I wouldn't say it's easier to deploy innovation in aviation. That's not the case, because it's always the safety case, and we always try as a human, you know, to see what we have already and build on that. So we very often build modernization innovation based on an existing structure. So if we look at Boeing or Airbus, let's take Airbus A320. The design is out from the 80s, you know, and we did some improvements to that. So we tried to build on that. But reflecting a little bit what Christophe said, I mean, aviation was from the history, from the beginning already, one of the targets. Yes, we crossed the canal from France to England and vice versa. So there were no boundaries, you know. We tried to cross the Atlantic then, and you know, going back and forth. So it was by nature already to make sure if we're crossing the Atlantic that we can refill our fuel, our airplane, and fly back, and we can land, and there are some harmonization done. So it was essential for the industry. Safety was and it is so difficult for the industry, because what happens in aviation is always a global effect. There is, even if an accident happens nationally, it always becomes a global factor for that, and that's the reason we are addressing everything a little bit on the global frame. But it has changed. You might remember that many years ago, 50, 60, 70 years ago, the major airlines were all state airlines. The airports were all state airports. The air navigation service providers doing air traffic control were state-run. Everything was state-run, and it's more privatized now. And we have gone through that, and that brought us also closer, because those who did the regulation did not have the expertise as such anymore, because they didn't have the airlines, they didn't have the airports. So they were more relying on the industry. And it started quite early to have a partnership with the industry, but also with the operator, with the users, the end users at the end of the day, very often already with R&D activities, with research and development. So there was a good spirit, and the spirit is still working well. We also said on standardization. Also, we as a standard developing organization try to work with other standard developing organizations. As soon as we see there is another organization working on a similar topic, we try to have a joint activity. And that means if you have a joint activity, the standard is technically identical. And we have a partner in the US, for example, where we do more than half of all our activities jointly. So that's a success story behind where we see. And then we are also recognized by international organizations like ICAO, we had the UN organization, recognized as an international standard developing organization, and they make already reference to our standards. So that starts from a global level to a regional level to the national level. So there is a stream through that.
Let me just follow up. And I know we're short on time. We might go a little bit over, so I hope everyone can bear with us. Just to follow up and maybe ask a more specific question. So in the nuclear sector, digital instrumentation has been a significant challenge. You know, in some countries it was adopted very quickly. In other countries, it still really hasn't been adopted. So there's been a major discontinuity in the industry on that point. And in the airline construction industry, fly-by-wire, for example, seemed to get it implemented quite quickly with all the with manufacturers and was accepted very rapidly. Why was that? You know, and again, I'm sure it wasn't easy, but why was that so successful? What is it about the system and aviation that made that technology, which for us in the nuclear sector was a very challenging one, that made it so readily accepted and quickly accepted?
Yeah, very often technology and innovation starts with a parallel world. So you have redundant systems in aviation. In our presentation we also talked that aviation has addresses risks and mitigate risks so that you have a probability to the 10 to the minus 9th that the hazardous effect occurs to aviation. So in order to achieve that, you have a whole structure how you certify that below. And if you are able to show compliance, and that's what standards are used, how do I show compliance against those requirements of 10 to the minus 9? Yeah, if you can show that compliance, then technology is accepted. Yeah, you have to prove to the authority how you do that, and you educate the authority in that. And that's the reason it's very often you have this very early engagement between the industry. Industry says, look at that. Nowadays we have artificial intelligence embedded system in our software, in our solutions. How can we address that? So they are working together and making sure it's accepted. It's accepted as a technology, but also accepted at the safety level. So the regulator concentrates much more on the level of safety instead of the technology itself. It's always the minimum navigation performance which is standardized and certified, and not the solution.
Thank you. Ramsey and CJ, you know, one of the things when I listened to Bruce Chu's talk this morning, and he talked about the approach that regulators need to take going into the future. He talked about things like adaptive regulation, risk-informed regulation, performance-based regulation. You know, for people in the nuclear sector, this is old news. We've been talking about this for 30 years. So I don't think in those areas, I think that the nuclear sector may very well be ahead of some of the other sectors. But the one area where nuclear perhaps is less, has been less successful is in this area of harmonization and international collaboration. And maybe start with you, Ramsey. You know, do regulators have the mandate to develop this kind of harmonization? Is it the job of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission to be harmonized with the Office of Nuclear Regulation in UK or with the Japan Nuclear Regulatory Authority? Is that in your mandate? Is that your job?
Thank you for this loaded question. I can speak at two levels. Is it our mandate? Our mandate is safety. And as I mentioned by Christian, with respect to the safety, it can be achieved at multiple levels. Are we banned or prohibited in our law or the Act, Nuclear Safety Control Act, from adopting information that is sound and factual that we will use towards our regulatory decision and our regulatory recommendation to the Commission? The answer is no, there is nothing prohibited. So I'll break it up at two levels. There is the policy level we spoke about with respect to harmonization, where you have the government supporting a policy to say harmonize in order to take on technical information via a process. On the CNSC itself, we started the collaboration under the leadership of ONR is one, or USNRC is one with President Velshi. The fact is the collaboration is not taking away at all the sovereignty with respect to decision making. The harmonization is the neutrons in Canada are the same as in the UK or the same are in the US. So that information is being consented to that is adequate to meet our requirements, so we can move forward with the regulatory recommendations to the Commission. And the outcome is going to be either a license or a certificate of a design or whatever is going to be the national level. But that is our work on, is there a prohibition in our mandate or our law? The answer is no. Our mandate is international collaboration. When I say we meet international obligations, but international collaboration is part of our requirements. But our law always talks about the fact you must have information so that the commission will render a decision on what is an acceptable risk, or the quote from the act is unreasonable risk to the public and the environment. And that's where the commission makes that decision with respect to what Christian said. Is it 10 to the -6 or 10 to the -9? What is acceptable? But I have a big answer with respect to your international collaboration on standards. Because us as a regulator in Canada, if we're moving towards innovation, we cannot wait till there is international standards in place. We're going to go and provide the commission with what we know instead of what we will not live in the what if scenario. So we know enough information, we are able to collect enough evidence so that the safety is preserved via the safety case, to include security requirements, so there is no impact or compromise with respect to what's being done. As a matter of fact, the CNSC right now, we establish a group. It's called the DIET, where it's looking at disruptive, innovative technology, so that we are looking at what we can adopt and how we can transform this implementation and our oversight with respect to assessment, compliance, and enforcement.
Ramzi, thank you very much. CJ, anything to add? I mean, based on your observations and the work that you do.
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, what Ramzi said resonated with me. I was really kind of thinking fundamentals here. Is it part of your mandate as a regulator to cooperate internationally? And I guess, I think perhaps for a large stationary technology like light water reactors, maybe you could argue no. Maybe that's different for something like airplanes or medical devices, where sort of by definition that the product's going to be moving around and can cross borders. But I also think about the efficiency principle of good regulation. And so even if it's not maybe part of your mandate or you're obligated to, I think, as a regulator, you owe it to the public to regulate in the most efficient way possible and to use the best scientific and technical information that's out there. So I do think cooperating with other countries makes a lot of sense. I also, having worked on some regulations and some guidance documents, I can tell you that at least in the United States, that's not built into the process really, in a way I think that it could be. It's kind of an afterthought. You write a regulatory guidance document or you write a regulation, and kind of you get to the very end, and there's this part where you got to publish in the Federal Register, and you've got to mention, what international standards are out there and what you did to sort of harmonize. And it's kind of this afterthought a lot of the times. And I think maybe it would be helpful to flip that around. And when you first start developing the technical basis for a new rule, a new regulation, a new guidance document, that the first thing you do is actually take a look around and see what else is out there. Is there an opportunity to collaborate with some other countries that are seeking to do something similar? Because I think with a lot of these efforts, again, having worked on some of them, you're 2-3 years in, you're at the very end, you're not that open to, oh, by the way, this other country's doing something similar. What are they doing? You're kind of wrapping things up. And so I think flipping the process around and trying to drive the collaboration on the front end might be a way to really improve the effectiveness.
Thank you, CJ. And Bruce, this might be the last question we have time for, but I wonder if you had some observations to make about developing countries. I mean, I think as we've had this conversation, we've really, while we haven't said it explicitly, we're really talking about the countries with very advanced infrastructures and technology, both in manufacturing and regulatory and analytical skills. What about countries that are more the customers of these technologies? And this becomes more relevant in the nuclear sector as we start talking about small modular reactors, because the possibility of exporting these small reactors to countries, I won't name countries, but the countries and they're developing, that don't have the extensive infrastructure comes up. This obviously has already happened in other sectors. I wonder if you can make some observations about this.
The primary one that comes to mind, and it goes to the last question you were asking about international harmonization. The part of the barrier for these countries is the cost of these systems, and we're in a window in time now where they are making critical choices that will affect climate, for decades to come. And so in this critical moment, the cost of these systems is critical. The cost of the systems is going to be affected by how much commonality are there across markets. You can't say mass produce, but can I produce in some volume so I can routinize a production process? And that helps ensure higher quality, which is what we're in favor of, and also reduces costs, which create the opportunity for these systems to come in and perhaps nudge the path on the carbon front. As Christy was talking about earlier today, the fact that we're not on a path now that is going to get us anywhere near where the goals have been set. And so for me, I think the questions you're wrestling with today are actually fundamental to shaping the demand for nuclear in the coming decades. That'd be the key point that comes to my mind. And again, I sometimes am, from a regulator standpoint, sometimes from the industry standpoint, the buyer's standpoint of these systems. And I think this is one where the interests intersect in an important way at sort of a juncture point or a fork in the road, perhaps, at this moment.
I appreciate that very much. And again, I think we could probably let this conversation go on for another couple of hours, but they aren't going to let us do that. But let me just ask if there's any of the panelists that wanted to make a burning point before we wrap up, and the floor is open if anyone wants to say anything. Just give you that opportunity. Okay, I don't see anybody leaping up with their hand, so I'm going to ask CJ. I think you're going to describe a polling process that we have coming together, so please, CJ.
Thank you, Director General. Yeah, Mahela, if you could just put the poll questions up. Great. So those of you that were here on day one, I promised that we were going to do this. Basically, what we're asking for is, we kind of want to see if the workshop shaped your thinking on some of these questions. So these are very similar to what we asked you on day one, and we're going to ask you to weigh in again. So the first question is, now that you've had a chance to look at the different sectors and see the presentations, which sector do you think is most similar to the nuclear sector? And so you can pick one of the 5 choices that you see here on your screen. The second question is, now that you've had the benefit of the workshop, why did you answer the way you did to question 1? So what characteristics of the sector you picked are most similar to nuclear in your opinion? And here you can pick as many as you feel apply. And the third one, I think maybe is the most important question, but the whole point of the workshop was to kind of get people thinking and get some cross-pollination going, and hopefully for you to have a kind of aha moment at some point in time and hear an idea that you really liked that you can bring to your home organization. So if that's the case for you, we'd ask that you'd say yes. If not, fair enough, tell us that. That feedback's helpful too, so that we can get smarter going forward. So those are the 3 questions. I'll give you a few moments to think about those and answer, and then we're going to put the results up here in real time, and we can kind of weigh in on them and talk about them briefly. Thanks. I guess I should point out this is really for the attendees, so panelists and NEA employees are not going to vote on this. Thanks.
Right. Thank you, CJ. So while you are answering those poll questions, I will proceed to move to the closing session. I don't think we need to give the too much time for people to push the buttons on their computer screen. So I think we can move on. And we're going to conclude the way we began with asking the President of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, Romina Velshi, our co-sponsor for today's or this week's workshop. As I mentioned previously, it was a conversation between Romina and I that really led to the formation of this workshop. And I will say that at this stage, I think that the workshop was a very good expression of what we were trying to achieve. But I will ask you, Romina, to give your views. Do you feel like we've accomplished our mission? And look forward to your closing comments. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. I believe the workshop has been a resounding success. Special thank you to my colleague Ramzi Jamal for his excellent moderation, and to the NEA for being such great co-hosts. The workshop was particularly timely given the rapid delivery of innovation that we have witnessed across the world this week. I'm of course talking about the COVID vaccines, their approvals, and commencement of distribution. As Pfizer's co-founder and CEO remarked in early November, the development of these vaccines is a victory for innovation, science, and global collaborative effort. But as we heard this week, the rapid development of these vaccines is hardly the norm in the medical sector. The speed and collaboration we have seen was prompted by an unprecedented global crisis. I sincerely hope that the nuclear sector will not have to be dependent on a similar sense of urgency to kick our collaborative effort on harmonization into high gear. I'm grateful that you took to heart the 4 challenges I issued at the start of the week and provided valuable insights and lessons learned. And I feel I'm going to give you a summary of the summaries we've just heard. On setting requirements that are risk-informed and allow for innovation and advancement, you stress the need for a performance or objective-based approach that provides a flexible framework. Your comments on leveraging lessons from other high reliability sectors suggest that there are some good universal best practices to consider. Those include staying focused on what we hope to achieve, strong international collaboration, and leveraging industry best practices to consult stakeholders on developing standards. You suggested that we could make progress in balancing harmonization and sovereignty by regulating using a risk-informed approach without compromising safety and by involving technical experts from various fields in the development of harmonized standards and requirements. And this is one area where we do have experience in the nuclear sector, as we have harmonized transport regulations while preserving national sovereignty in decision-making. We just need to do it on a much grander scale. Leveraging lessons learned from the aviation sector suggests the nuclear sector could benefit from stronger international governance. Getting to the question, Bill, that you just asked, whether through enhancing the mandate of the IAEA or the NEA or creating a standalone organization, this would potentially allow for coordination and harmonization on regulations, training, supply chain, certification, compliance, maintenance, accident investigations, and so on. On ensuring public trust, it is clear that we need to avoid being seen as too close to industry and maintain our independence as regulators. When it comes to engaging with stakeholders, it needs to be done early, often, and throughout the process. Engagement also needs to reflect diversity. Consultation with a large variety of audiences is essential to building relationships, ensuring different perspectives are considered, and earning the public's confidence. One thing I heard today that particularly resonated with me is the need for adaptive processes and approaches to regulation that rely more on trial and error, rapid feedback loops, and a more responsive, iterative approach. In other words, the need for regulators to prioritize agility. That is something we have embraced at the CNSC, and I know some of my regulator colleagues have as well. The insights you shared have given us much to consider, and the hard work is now ours to chart a course to a future. I look forward to the NEA's report in the coming months on the actions arising from this workshop. I fully expect that it will identify actions that policymakers, regulators, industry, and international organizations in the nuclear sector can or should take to advance harmonization. The CNSC will continue to play a leadership role on harmonization, and we welcome and encourage all nations and organizations to join us in these efforts. In fact, there may be greater urgency in Canada to prioritize harmonization, given the Climate Action Plan unveiled by Canada's government just last week. The plan establishes 5 pillars to achieve Canada's 2030 greenhouse gas reduction target and to be net zero by 2050. Notably, it reiterates the intention to launch a small modular reactor action plan, which I understand will be released in just a couple of hours. The Canadian government intends to work with interested parties to advance SMRs to reduce emissions, decarbonize heavy industries, and spur economic development. And that includes working with partners from the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union. So the writing is on the wall, and it is fairly clear that our government is readying significant support for the development of SMRs. As Canada's independent nuclear regulator, that does not mean we're getting our rubber stamps ready, but it does mean that things are starting to crystallize at the policy level, and we need to ensure that we are ready for the rubber to hit the road. Your important work this week will help ensure we get there safely, smartly, and quickly. And I hope together with all in the nuclear sector joining us. Thank you all very much for your participation. I wish you and your loved ones a safe and happy holiday. I'll now pass the mic to my dear friend Bill Magwood for closing out the conference. Bill?
Thank you very much, President Velshi. And before I begin, we are now going to put up the results of the poll. And as you can see, the similarities between air transport, including drones, was highlighted as really one of the key areas that we should be focusing on in terms of the similarities to the nuclear sector. So that is not a surprise to me at all. I think that is very much what one would have expected. Then you see in the second question that you know, the level of risk makes the nuclear sector a little different, a little less stark in this particular poll. And of course, the last one, we appreciate seeing that you all found value in this exercise. So that verifies that we have assembled an appropriate workshop. I will keep my remarks relatively brief. I simply want to take the opportunity to again thank the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. This was a true pleasure to work with them to put this together. President Velshi being one of the inspirations of doing this. And of course, Ramzi Jamal, who worked very hard and was emceeing the discussions through the entire week. Ramzi, you were fantastic. Thank you very much for your efforts in doing that. I also thank the NEA staff, Veronique Royer and CJ Fong, who really worked quite hard on this over the last several weeks and very diligently, as well as many other people and their staff. But I do want to highlight Mahela, who was very involved in all the details, as well as many other people in the staff, Akani and others who were involved in the preparation of this. And as well as my staff, Charlotta Lundell, who kept make sure that I showed up when I was supposed to. One of the things that I would highlight is that something that I think you all already understand is that nuclear is different. Nuclear is not the same as pharma. It is not the same as aviation. But there are lessons to be learned. And the purpose of this workshop was to see where there might be some things that we can pull into the nuclear sector and advance our discussion about harmonization and innovation. For my part, what I saw was that in some ways, nuclear is very much in the 21st century. Nuclear understands risk better than most other industries. Nuclear has been focused on performance-based regulation for decades, as I said earlier. But in other ways, nuclear is still in the 1950s. And I do think that one case where we are in the 1950s is in international harmonization. I believe that is the most difficult challenge that we face. I think the structure of the industry, the structure of the regulatory infrastructure makes it more difficult to harmonize than perhaps it has been in other areas. The Nuclear Energy Agency, of course, is designed as a platform for cooperation. So we can help with this, obviously. And perhaps in comparison to many other international organizations, we are structured with the flexibility to work with what I would call coalitions of the willing. If there are a handful of countries that want to do a demonstration, to want to do a sandbox, to use, I think, Bruce Chu's term, we're equipped to do that. And so we look forward to working with our members and perhaps even countries beyond our membership to pursue these activities. But the most important thing is that we have to get this done quickly. As several observers made today, including Kirsty Grogan in her presentation. If our objective is to meet the climate challenge, we need to move very quickly. The decisions by governments and industry around the world are being made today. And if we don't have the technologies and regulations in place to support advanced nuclear over the next decade or 15 years, it's going to be too late. So this is not a long-term project. We have to do this now. So we have to do that by working together. And I look forward, and from our standpoint, the Nuclear Energy Agency, to helping facilitate that as we go forward. So again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to all the speakers, all the panelists, all the session chairs. This was a really educational and fantastic discussion. And as it is my personal admonition to our staff, that we don't have discussions for the sake of discussion, but that we do them for the purpose of productive action. Please look for the next steps that come from this. We will take the knowledge that we have gained today, and we will use that to formulate next steps and paths forward. So again, I thank all of you for paying attention. Thank you for participating. Thank you for your questions. And please stay safe wherever you are, and happy holidays. And I look forward to seeing all of you in 2021. Thank you very much.